Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
The Lumberjack World Championship happens every year in Hayward, Wisconsin, in the state's Northwoods region. But why? WUWM's Ma'ian Silver speaks with historian Willa Hammett Brown to find out. Brown is the author of the book Gentlemen in the Woods: Manhood, Myth, and the American Lumberjack. They talk about the area's logging history, how logging inspired timber sports, and the trajectory of women into competitions.
Can you tell me a little bit about that area, northern Wisconsin's timber industry, and like how it flourished? And for people who are geographically challenged, we're talking about like the northernmost part of the state, kind of like an hour to an hour and a half from Lake Superior.
Yep, absolutely. It was part of a whole hardwood forest, the old white pine forest that covered the UP of Michigan and the upper part of the Mitten, then through that sweep of Wisconsin and the northern part of Minnesota as well. A huge piece of timberland. And the logging of that land was the single biggest real transformation of American landscape, one of the biggest transformations in American history. It was the height of lumbering when that part of the land was lumbered in the 1880s through about the 1910s. And it really is what allowed the Midwest to flourish. Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Omaha, all of these cities are built with Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan Northwoods white pine. Hayward itself was actually kind of famous. It was one of, each state had a few of these wild towns that really could be compared to what we think of as Western cow towns. In fact, there have been studies done that the logging towns of the upper Midwest had higher crime rates and violence than the sort of famous old Wild West towns. And Hayward was one of Wisconsin's famous dens of iniquity, which is why it's very cool that it's where they now do the Lumberjack World Championships. It feels incredibly apt that they would come back home to Hayward. It was a remarkable time that has been sort of lost to history on purpose, because in many ways, there's a great quote I love from a woman who watched this herself, who was the daughter of a lumber camp owner, who referred to the logging of the upper Midwest as an epic and a tragedy. And it was epic in scale, and it was tragic in outcomes. So we celebrate parts of it. We celebrate this sort of mythical, made-up idea of what a lumberjack was about, and we very purposefully forget other parts of it about environmental destruction, poverty, fire, and all the other side effects that were really fairly tragic, particularly in Wisconsin, actually.
Logging and lumberjacking was a traditionally male-dominated profession. What was the role and history of women in this industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really was an extremely male profession, to the point where women were banned in most camps. Women were seen as possible distractions and possible ways of tearing apart the camps. Towards the end of the 19th century, you've got these camps of 80 to 150 men working together, and so drinking, gambling, and women are banned and seen as ways to lower morale. In smaller camps, women would be employed, and even in some big camps, in the cook shack. Often in very small camps, that would just mean the foreman's wife was the cook, but there were cooks and cookies who were, cookies being a cook's assistant, who were women who were hired. The real largest group of women to follow the lumberjack trade were sex workers and prostitutes. There were brothels across the upper Midwest. A lot of these small towns would be, I'm thinking of Seney, Michigan, a town that out of season had a population of 400, but had 7 brothels, I believe. So it's not the 200 men of that town who are keeping 7 brothels going. It's lumberjacks who are doing that. And you really didn't see women even in the summer. The spaces men were in were very male dominated. These taverns were very male places, and the few women who were in them would either be the daughters of tavern owners who would be working, or these sort of notorious women along the style of, if you think of like a Calamity Jane in the West. So they're really, the opening up of lumbering to women is an extremely modern phenomenon.
You're tuned into Lake Effect. I'm WUWM's Maayan Silver, speaking with Willa Hammett-Brown, historian, speaker, and writer. We are talking about women in lumberjacking, and you said it really wasn't a thing until modern times. Before that, I want a little nugget about how lumberjacking became timber sports, or, that kind of competitive lumberjacking.
Of course. It's a really interesting story because it's also the story of how we changed what we think of as lumberjacking. So logging still happens, obviously. Forestry is still a big industry in this country. But right today, it requires much more specialized knowledge of machinery than it does of shimmying up logs or log burling. That's the log rolling in a river. Those skills are attached to a largely dead form of the industry. They're attached to a sort of nostalgic late 19th, early 20th century idea of what lumbering was and the way lumbering happened in the upper Midwest, in the North Woods, in these winter camps where these skills were really prized. There were some competitions that began while lumbering still existed. We have burling competitions happening in the late 19th century around in Michigan and Minnesota. And some of those were actual lumberjacks sort of showing off in the summer, and there started being money made out of that. But it really takes off when we get the full-blown nostalgia for the old, ye olde lumberjacky. And that nostalgia bears very little resemblance to the actual industry. So after the industry left in the 1920s, the Northwoods were just totally devastated. The largest fire in American history was the Peshtigo fire, which was one of the deadliest fires as well, may have killed up to 1,200 people. You get these fires just devastating huge swaths of landscape. And in Wisconsin in particular, in the 1930s, there was actually a second Dust Bowl that no one talks about, which was in the cutover region of northern Wisconsin, the area we're talking about. So you have these economically devastated regions, also damaged by fire. There's not a lot that's easy to recover industry-wise around there because pine grows in sandy soil, and sandy soil doesn't make for great farming soil. So what the region turns to is tourism as a way to recover. And, still, if you've ever spent a beautiful weekend at the Apostle Islands, you know that northern Wisconsin is a lovely place to go as a tourist. And at the same time that region is turning to tourism, there's also sort of a national nostalgia for the closing of the West and a national nostalgia for what is seen as these sort of true white heroes of the West, the cowboys, the lumberjacks, your Johnny Appleseeds. And a lot of this has to do with just changing ideas of what it is to be a man in modern society. It has much more to do with factory work or office work. You're not out there doing things. And so there becomes a lot of nostalgia for that work. And by the 1930s and 40s, there start being these fairs with reenactments. And that's where you start seeing timber sports really take off, is it's a celebration of really raw masculine strength and skill. It doesn't really bear a resemblance to the actual industry, which was a pretty standard industry in late 19th century terms, which is to say poor workers with very little way up, really bad conditions, terrible wages, very little respect for management for the actual workers themselves. It was a real industrial scale extractive industry, but what we celebrate about it is a sort of smaller scale folksy interpretation of that.
Well, two things. So the lumberjacking trade is traditionally just felling trees, right? I mean, would that be the biggest skill that you need to have?
There are actually a lot of really important skills in lumberjacking trade. So there is felling trees, which requires you to have an understanding of how trees are going to fall. That ability to look up and see predict the direction it'll fall, to notch it in the right place and fell it, which is part of lumberjack competitions still. Bark stripping, log stacking, which used to be in the late 19th and early 20th century, that was the big show-off thing, is to how high you could stack a load of timber, and you get these like 10-ton stacks of timber that were totally impractical. They were just to show off. They make really cool photographs of these dudes standing on these 30-foot piles of these sleigh rides of logs. You would then, while it was still frozen, use ice roads to get those to the side of the river. And once the ice thawed, those would be pushed into the river and driven down the river. And that's where a lot of the really high-skilled work comes in, of being able to find out which logs you need to move along to stop a jam, of being able to walk across the logs on the river, which is where you get log rolling from, is that ability to balance on those logs as you're trying to keep them moving down the river. It was both highly skilled and incredibly dangerous work.
Is it kind of a myth, the idea that these lumberjacks would come back to town after days of lumberjacking and then they'd try to have competitions with each other to be like, who's the best at this? Is that sort of like a myth?
It did start happening in the late 19th century, but really what happened is after a season of lumberjacking in the woods, they came to town, drank themselves silly, and spent all their money. The real thing they did was they called it the spree, and they were damn proud of it. And the spree was essentially an attempt to see how quickly you could blow all of your earnings on drink and gambling and women. And then, if you had some time in there to roll some logs, sure, but you were probably drunk. And you can think of it like a rodeo. It's not that cowboys didn't need the skills that are shown in a rodeo, but that's not what being a cowboy looked like.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then we were talking about this modern trail of women into this. What about women into timber sports? Like, how did that start?
My understanding is that it started 20 or 30 years ago, but really took off in the last sort of 20 years. I think part of the thing about lumber sports and timber sports is they are so distinctly masculine, in that they are this nostalgic exercise in showing the skills of an all-male industry. And all of the nostalgia is for this sort of mythologized and deeply problematic, but whatever, image of the white frontier male hero. And I just love that women have taken to going into that space and showing that they can hold space there. To me, I think about it sort of like when you think about men's and women's sports, it's like taking on football rather than taking on, I can't think of another sport that's less distinctly masculine, but it's going
soccer.
Soccer, I guess. It's going into the most male-coded space you could possibly find and showing that you can do it, which I find incredible, and I think speaks a lot to the appeal to women, is that there are all sorts of places you can compete, but to choose to compete on grounds that are so tied up with our ideas of what it is to be a man is awesome.
That's a nice description of the trajectory. Willa Brown, thank you so much for speaking about lumberjacking, the history of it, and women in the sport. It's been very interesting.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now the flies are thick and the men get sick. It's cold as it can be. Nothing's unexpected in the North Country.
Willa Hammett Brown is a historian and the author of Gentlemen in the Woods, Manhood, Myth, and the American Lumberjack. She spoke with WUWM's Maiyan Silver.
On the wild and windy shores of old Superior.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.